Let's go. Welcome to the Delingpole with me, James Delingpole, and I'm very excited about this week's special guest. We have met before, and actually, the last time we met, I really didn't feel that I'd done him justice. His name is Alexander Adams. We met, didn't we, Alexander, at the Battle of Ideas, and I grabbed a moment with you then. You're an art critic. Which sounds like it's not as exciting as I think the stuff you actually write. I mean, you really are amazing. In fact, I'll tell you a secret, which you may find embarrassing, or you may find pleasing, which is that I keep a copy of your book, which is here, by my loo, and every time I go for a dump, I read a few paragraphs of your essays in that book. Culture War, Art, Identity, Politics and Cultural Entryism, which by weird topical coincidence has on its cover a picture of a statue being pulled down. And I know, and you contacted me, you said, look, can we talk about iconoclasm? And you are the man to talk about it, both from an art historical perspective and also from a kind of culture wars perspective. And you poor sod, where do you live? Tell us where you live.
I live for my sins in Bristol, England, which is the site of, well, do you want to intro it or shall I?
No, you tell us about Bristol. I mean, I used to love Bristol. I used to like going down there, but I mean, it's fallen, hasn't it?
Well, I mean, I've known it for 5 years. I've lived here for 5 years, and I moved here because the quality of life is very good. It's quite a handsome city. There's lots of old parts of it. It wasn't completely bombed during the war. It's in gets good air. We're quite close to the sea. The traffic's not great, but I don't drive, so that doesn't matter. And okay, so basically, before we have to start this conversation, I have to put on the record that I do not support slavery now, in the past, or in the future. I do not support or endorse enslavement or the slave trade. And now you're wondering why. No, you're having to say.
I'm going to throw you off the pod for that.
You're thinking, why is he stating the bleeding obvious? Because we can have this discussion and people at the end of it are going to do a Kathy Newman. They're going to say, so what you're saying is you support slavery. So I need to get that out.
Actually, mate, I think you overestimate the number of SJW types who watch this podcast. I think I'm so niche now. I don't think anyone... I think the only people who come to I've almost reached the stage, and I think it's a good thing rather than a bad thing. I don't want to tempt fate here, but I almost think that I'm too small for them to give a damn about. So I'm just this kind of niche purveyor of politically incorrect entertainment to people who've had just about enough. But that's fine. I think we've got a good thing going here. And I really value having you. Let me just explain why I think your book, Culture War, is just one of the best books on the subject of, well, particularly the way that the left uses art as a way, or abuses art as a way of destroying Western civilization. Because, of course, so much of our civilization is dependent on art, on the canon, on our history, on our understanding of that shared history, which is actually what you were saying in that article I read. Maybe I should put a link to it, or maybe you're just going to repeat it anyway, so maybe there's no need. But the article you wrote for, was it REO?
Yes, so there's two articles. There's one I wrote for REO, which is about iconoclasm. And then I have a related one on, well, there's a different topic anyway that we might get to later on. But the principal one is it's an essay on, what's it called? It's called Iconoclasm and Iconoclasm and the Erasing of History on ariomagazine.com.
Okay, so let's cut to the chase. imagine I'm a typical Bristolian. I've got probably, I'm white, obviously. I've got long dreadlocks, or maybe I haven't anymore. Maybe that's cultural appropriation. But back in the day, they used to have matted dreadlocks, didn't they?
Yeah.
I probably live in a very expensive house provided for me by my parents because I'm a trustafarian, but I've got very left-wing views. And I think that I cheered when the people of Bristol pulled down the statue of the hateful Edward Colston and symbolically put their knees on his bronze neck and then dragged him to the docks and chucked him in the river because he was a slave trader, and there was no room for slave trade in the modern age, or no room for celebrating it. How would you respond to this this open and shut argument?
I would say welcome to the rest of the human race. I don't know what quite they thought they were achieving. I think it was a celebration. It was a carnival. They wanted to blow off steam. They wanted to show that they were opposed to slavery, which I believe is the current position throughout almost the entire population of Great Britain and the Western world. And they thought, well, you know, because we don't really have many problems with sort of police brutality, aside from, you know, whatever happened in Minneapolis, because it's obviously that was, you know, a very disturbing video, and you know, clearly that, you know, there should be some sort of justice and this should be fully pursued and prosecuted. If, you know, I think it's a fairly clear case that there needs to be some sort of prosecution. But we don't have any racial flashpoints at the moment. We have had them in Britain in the past. Bristol is a city, is a very, very left-wing city, as you know. It's very, it is relatively affluent with patches of deprivation. It's got a fair-sized migrant population and sort of ethnic minority population.
Well, particularly in St Paul's, you had the St Paul's riots, didn't you?
Yeah.
A few years back, I remember those, and so there is a sort of black community in Bristol, which produced the Bristol sound. I mean, we had things like Tricky and Massive Attack. That was probably the last time Bristol contributed anything useful to our culture, wasn't it?
Well, you're overlooking Banksy. Aren't you a Banksy fan?
I think Banksy is absolutely. In fact, you tell me about. Go on, before we move on to Colston, I think Banksy is shit. I think almost everything that's wrong with our culture is embodied by Banksy, and his take on the world is so achingly obvious. So he thinks that what? War is bad. He thinks that war is bad. He thinks that the police are mindless thugs. He thinks that Brexit voters are bigoted Neanderthals. He thinks that migrants are, you know, culturally enriching, always with no drawbacks. Yeah.
You know, capitalism's bad. Ooh, you know. And
he's the master of the edgy hot take, isn't he? He makes art out of really hot takes. But the thing I really felt last time when we talked is that I never kind of got out of you quite the depth of your art historical knowledge. You really know your stuff. And can I just briefly, because I like doing digressions, before we move on to iconoclasm and stuff, is Banksy going to find his way into the canon? Is he in the canon already, in fact?
If there is enough, if he becomes popular enough, if he's influential enough, if he's considered good enough as an artist of his type, he could enter the canon. There's no reason for him not to. No, but I think I think it's hard to sort of prejudge history. I think you can only really sort of say with certainty, you know, like, oh, someone from the last 30 or 50 years has entered the canon. It isn't really time enough to judge.
Too soon. Okay, fair enough. So but you say Basquiat is in the canon, isn't he now?
I would say he's entered by now. Yeah. I enjoy his stuff. I think he's got loads of punch, loads of energy. Very painterly artist. very rich, wide source of sources and influences. I think he's pretty inventive as well. Yeah, I think there's a lot to like about him. I think he can be repetitious. I think he can be derivative, but I think you could say that about almost any artist. They have sort of their major works and their minor works, and then they've got works sort of sort of five-finger exercises.
I'm glad you said that. I thought you were going to diss Basquiat. I think we did briefly touch on him in our last podcast, but I think he's great. I mean, he gives me great pleasure. I think he gives me pleasure in the way an artist that you don't like so much gives me pleasure. And I love David Hockney. You're not such a fan, are you?
Yeah, well, we covered this before. I said it was I quite like some of his early prints and drawings, and I think they're very skillful. But I wouldn't go for any further than that. No, and I think about the canon. It's worth saying that you can accept the concept of the canon without having to falsely praise any of the artists who are actually in there. You can say, well, I disagree with this artist, and you can set up your own canon and you can put that out there, and you can disagree and you can critique the artists who are in the canon. But you cannot remove them. You cannot ex cathedra say, well, this artist cannot be in the canon. It's a question of it's a collective endeavor, and you may not like, and you're not expected to praise artists who are in there who you don't like. You can dissent, and it's through this debate about the qualities of various artists that we reach a consensus, an overall consensus, and that is the Western canon. It's not imposed from above, which is something that your feminists will tell you that it was a patriarchal canon. No. It's a canon of what has influenced artists and art collectors and art lovers and writers and theorists, and many of those are women, and many of the artists entering the canon in recent decades are women.
Yes, actually, this started out as a digression, but I actually realised that this debate is very relevant to what we're going to discuss later about iconoclasm, which is that. What would you call them? The cultural Marxists, the social justice warriors? What do you call the modern left? What's your catch-all term?
Well, I try to avoid SJW because that's kind of derogatory. I say sort of social activists, which is a more neutral term. And you could have a theoretic. I mean, like you could be in the 19th century, and you could be an abolitionist. That would be a form of social activism, which I think most of us would agree was worthwhile and something that we can subscribe to. But a lot of those big causes have gone now, and you've got people who have a religion-shaped hole in their life because they're not Christians. And they've sought out this cult of social justice. And social activism is a way of enacting that social justice. It's a way of showing your fealty to the cult of social justice. And this is
showing your virtue.
Yeah. Well, I would say that the difference is that in the past we embodied our virtues by acting in a virtuous way, and this was sometimes done privately and sometimes never seen at all. It was in the way you lived your life, and it was often private, and it was hard work, and it was something that you did throughout your life, and it wasn't something that you necessarily expected to be rewarded for, except in heaven if you were a Christian. However, today virtue is not embodied; it is displayed. It is signaled, and you post it on Instagram, and you expect to get pats on the back for it. And I don't think that's virtue.
Yes. And so we have this movement. Call it what you will. I mean, I think SJWs for short works. That they want to remake our world. I mean, it's almost like a year zero thing, isn't it? Yeah. They want to destroy our past. Reject everything that we've accumulated the value.
Yeah. So the article of the new article I've written, which has not appeared yet, but will either appear on my website or will appear on Spiked or maybe some other outlet. My title was "Towards Britain's Year Zero," because this is completely in line with revolutionary philosophy. Is that you have a problem? Your past is constraining you. It is unjust. You are the product of that injustice and this inequity, and you must correct this by erasing history, by destroying the art of the history. the history, the art of your history, your cultural background. So in the article in Ario, I wrote about the Cultural Revolution and the way that the Cultural Revolution was. It was a cult of personality. People, the Chinese, had spent sort of, one generation of the school children had never known anything but Mao. They venerated him. He came in above the heads of the Chinese Communist Party and said, you are being held back by old beliefs, by old ideas, by old standards. We need to remove those old standards. We need to return to a pure revolution. We need this revolution at the baseline. So we need a year zero. And this instituted an era of a cultural holocaust where they destroyed old temples, scrolls, artworks. They even vandalized, they destroyed Confucius's grave. They dug up old saints and the graves of priests, and they hacked apart the bones. They tortured nuns. They tortured monks, Buddhist monks and Christian monks, and it was this fury, this wave of moral indignation that made them tear down old statues. Which takes us to what happened on Sunday in Britain. We've also had two generations of people indoctrinated in left-wing ideas about post-colonialism, decolonization, feminism, race activism, and so forth. And people have been trained to believe that Britain is a hateful country and that they have inherited a race guilt. If you are white and you are British, you are responsible for the slave trade. Never mind all the other examples of the slave trade, which don't really count, but you are uniquely responsible for what has happened in the past. And the only way to expiate your guilt, you won't be able to do it completely, but you can just make a demonstration of it by tearing down a statue, by defacing a statue, by burning a picture, by burning a book, maybe firebombing a building or two.
Right. Just rewind a second. The Cultural Revolution was what, about 1975?
No, it was no. It was the late. I think it was about 68 or 66.
Oh, okay.
68. So it was in the late 60s, and it carried on for about 5 or 10 years. But it had to be scaled back so disastrously because it caused the deaths of millions and millions of people. It was absolutely, you had troops of school children sort of killing their teachers. You had what happened was the police, the political police were told to step back, that they couldn't interfere, they couldn't restrain the.
Sounds familiar.
The young guard of idealists who were the new soldiers of the revolution. So it started in the late 60s. And it carried on until, I think, the early 70s. It petered out because it had to be controlled very quickly because it was escalating into extreme mob violence and complete social breakdown. It was directed by Mao, but it wasn't controlled on every level. But he soon realised that it was actually very dangerous for him and for the whole country.
How much stuff was damaged? I mean, how much of China's historical heritage was destroyed?
The
put a percentage on it or not?
I think there's a large amount. Let's have a look, because I mentioned in the article also the example of what happened in Dublin, where they destroyed a statue of
Nelson.
Nelson. Yes, that's right. It was Nelson. Okay, so I've got a quote here from a book that I used as a source. By the end of the Cultural Revolution, 4,922 of the 6,843 registered, officially designated sites of cultural or historical interest in Beijing had been destroyed. So that's 2/3 of these cultural significance places in Beijing had been completely destroyed. The Khufu Temple and grave and temple of Confucius was desecrated, and 6,618 registered cultural artifacts had been liquidated at that one site.
Okay, so we've got the Cultural Revolution in China. We've had the ISIS destroying Palmyra. and also the Taliban destroying the Buddhas of Bamiyan. And then if you go to the British Museum, you see stuff that Assyrian reliefs, but presumably the Assyrians destroyed things that came before them. I mean, I suppose there's a long history of iconoclasm and destruction. What's the purpose of it?
Well, I mean, it goes back. It goes back at least to Roman times. You had the cases of where emperors would want to destroy the memory of a previous emperor, so they would have the inscriptions and the faces hacked off carvings in Rome and throughout the empire. And it comes back to this idea of it's partly emotional, it's partly a venting of emotion. It's partly tactical, because if you control the past, if you erase the past, no one can quote the past against you. No one can use evidence from the past against you because the evidence doesn't exist. Also, you shape the way the future is seen because you have erased what was said before, people who came before, and you leave your own mark, even if that mark is you defacing something. And I think that there's also, you can use it as a tactical thing. I mean, the suffragettes used iconoclasm during the 1910s. Actually, it was a campaign that started in about 1910 and went up to 1914 and ended only with the commencement of the First World War. What you had suffragettes going into public galleries and defacing paintings. Now, sometimes these were tactical things, so they were attacking a portrait of a grand sort of lord or a politician or something. Sometimes it would be to do with a portrayal of beauty. I think there was one suffragette who said, I hated to see this beautiful image of a beautiful woman, so I attacked it because of the way they treat women in such an ugly way in society. So this was a sort of proto-feminist, of course. And this was a series of attacks that took place all over Britain in major art galleries. I think there was about sort of 20 of them, 30 of them. And these were all reported in the news, and they were actually quite carefully staged and coordinated. And these reports appeared in the news, and they only ended when the First World War commenced. Interestingly, many of these suffragettes went on to become major figures in the British Union of Fascists in the 1930s. So I think this tells you something about the psychology of people who feel it is their duty and their right to destroy as part of their expression.
Yes. And of course, so much of Britain's history, particularly art history, has been destroyed during the Reformation, wasn't it? I mean, I imagine that was the worst period of destruction. There's virtually no surviving medieval art that unless it's been hidden behind partitions and things. I mean, the Wilton diptych is one of the few surviving pieces from that period, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. So that's why it's a particularly good example, but we don't have anything much to compare it to. I mean, we have a few not frescoes, but murals that were painted over white, so they were saved because they were just simply covered up. People didn't know they existed, or perhaps people were covering them up in order to preserve them because they thought, well, maybe at some stage this will be uncovered. So it's really interesting when I was researching iconoclasm. I read in a history book that iconoclasm of the Reformation was one of the only times it was a bottom-up movement, a widespread movement of anger and iconoclasm. Previously, they had some other examples of, I think there was a king who was particularly upset about the iconography of Thomas à Becket, who had been martyred, and he was frustrated about this, and he actually commanded that people deface the sort of icons of Thomas à Becket because it was seen as a threat to royal authority. So this was actually imposed from the top. But the Reformation was an example of ordinary people taking out a very strong and viscerally held and directed animus towards the Catholic Church. And I think this is principally to do with corruption. I think that people had seen a lot of corruption. They'd seen the selling of indulgences. They saw monks and priests becoming very rich, and they saw this as ungodly. And they also saw it as exploitation. So there's class jealousy. There's a sense of religious grievance that this is actually sinful. And there's also, so I think there's many elements that go into it. And the iconoclasm of the Reformation in England is one of the few examples of a real groundswell of strong feeling, which leads to the destruction of art and artifacts and relics and so forth.
Right. Okay. So the Reformation was what, round about Henry VIII, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 1530s or something. Yeah, 1540s.
So the break with Rome was the excuse from on top that gave the people the reason they needed to start smashing up stuff, smashing up monasteries and whatever.
Yes,
and
then Henry VIII
of course
authorised this. He permitted it.
Henry VIII order. Okay, so he made it. Yes, exactly. So he made it legitimate, and then we of course had the Puritans with their version of iconoclasm. The Puritans stabling their horses in Durham Cathedral and just causing no end of damage to what was left, I suppose, from the Reformation.
Yeah, and additionally, one of the big prizes, of course, was they sold off Charles I's art collection. So that's why you have so many great pictures in foreign collections all over Europe that used to belong to Charles I that was sold by the Puritans. The
right. I'd forgotten that. Well, I don't think I even knew that detail. So my goodness. So when we look enviously at the collections in the Louvre and the, I don't know, the Uffizi or wherever, all the great galleries of Europe, this stuff should have been ours.
This is the family silver that they sold off to pay for whatever the Commonwealth was doing in the sort of in that particular era. Yeah.
Well, I imagine they sold it off to pay for all the kind of the grim outfits that they wore and the hats, big hats.
Yeah, I don't
something
know.
Like that.
Well, because there was no direct taxation, as it were. So I guess this was sort of general booty for the state.
Right, I see. Okay, so what have we lost by not having that medieval art and by not having the things that the Puritans destroyed?
I think it disconnects us from our history. I think it's the thing about the history is that you should have a fair selection of it, both good and bad, of the things that you care about and the things that you reject as a society. You learn from your past, and you learn from doing things differently from your past, as well as from admiring the past and following the great art of the canon. So the British canon, I mean, I think it impoverished British art because we lost a lot of whatever native British art there was. Because you'll find that a lot of the court artists from the late Middle Ages on, from the Stuarts or from the Tudors onwards, is basically foreign artists who come over here. And they're, so you have Van Dyck and you have Lely and various other painters from the Low Countries and so forth, coming over and working in the court. Hans Holbein, of course, the most famous of all. They come over and this is what our art now consists of. Yet there was another tradition, there was a native British tradition that we've lost because most of it has been destroyed. So we have this sort of discontinuous past where we only see the great art of the court, but we've lost a lot of the folk art, a lot of the common art, a lot of the common sacred art, because it was almost completely destroyed during the Reformation.
Yes, that's, now you put it like that, that is awful. So you would have had people being students of great artists, but that connection between our past is completely completely gone. Do we apart from the Wilton diptych, do we have any idea whether our old art was any good or not, our native tradition?
I mean, that's a good piece, but it's really, we don't know if it's representative or not, and we don't know enough about what the native tradition was to distinguish it from the painting of the Low Countries. I assume it would have been something similar to the painting of the Low Countries, rather than Germanic, yes, or rather than French. But we have so little of it, it's very difficult to tell. And the international Gothic style has certain strands that you can detect as coming from a certain place. But what the British tradition was in fine art, we don't know, because there's so little of it.
Right. So let's fast forward to the present. And I don't know about you, but I'm really, really worried about what is happening now. I mean, so we had the crowd successfully pulling down a statue of Edward Colston, which let's face it, the leftists in Bristol have been agitating for some time because of Edward Colston's involvement with the Africa trading company,
the transatlantic slave trade and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't just slaves, was it? It was all manner of trading with West Africa, and he was a man of his time. I mean, I imagine that nobody was really against the slave trade.
He was engaging in practice that was perfectly legal at the time, and that's not to say it was universally approved of in moral terms, which is why things changed, and which is why Britain evolved and said, well, actually, having taken up the slave trade, which they picked up from the Arabs, because there's not a tradition of slavery in Britain or in England. It didn't exist. It came from Arabia. It was from contact in the Near East. And this was something that we perpetuated for 250 years. And then we changed and we became the leading country working for the abolition of the slave trade around the world.
Yes.
Yes. But yeah. But that's the side of the story that doesn't really fit with the Marxist narratives.
Also, I mean, Edward Colston, he was a great benefactor of Bristol. It established numerous almshouses and schools and other charitable foundations, and presumably,
as well as Colston, the original Colston Hall. Colston Hall, which is one of the major music venue.
Yeah, great music venue, exactly. And I imagine that he contributed greatly to the prosperity of the city. It wouldn't be what it is today without Edward Colston, I would guess.
Yeah, and I think that I think the statue was posthumous. I don't know when the statue was created, but presumably it was posthumous to mark his contribution to the city, to his native city. Yeah. And also remember, he's providing lots of employment for people in the city. So he was a major employer as well.
So again, to pose that original question to you, slavery is bad. Slavery is abhorrent. Why should we have a statue in Bristol to a slaver? Why should it be allowed to stay up?
Because you can't teach your history if you've erased it. You can't say how bad slavery is, and you say, oh, well, actually, slave owners were really important and they had loads of wealth and influence and they used to dominate the city, and yet we can't give you a single name of a building which was named after them. We haven't got a single statue of them. People think, did this really happen? Did this really exist? Yes, it did really exist. So keep the statues, keep the place names, and you put a plaque next to it. You put a plaque next to it and explain why this place name is as it is, and you contextualize it. And you keep your history and you show this is something that we don't appreciate anymore. This is something that, okay, it was appreciated at the time, it was legal, it was thought appropriate. Now, think about whether you think this is appropriate. This is the way you teach it. This is the way you show the history. This is the way you learn from history, by having examples of history that you reject as well as things that you celebrate. And so once you have that history, you can teach it. If you erase it, then who's to say it was ever there at all? Maybe it's a lie. Maybe it never really existed.
Yes. And of course, there's a more worrying element to this, isn't there? Which, as you argue in your excellent REO essay, that once you start pulling down statues, it can turn much nastier than that. Explain.
And well, the reason it escalates is, well, let's look at what happened. It's not just the actions of the mob, it's the actions of the people around the mob. So this crowd there were police at the event and they did not stop it. In fact, some of them said they approved of it. The Bristol Council said they approved of it. They turned it actually into a social media event. They said, we support the fight against sort of slavery and racism. So, hashtag take the knee, do an Instagram photo and do hashtag take the knee or whatever to show your support for the demonstrators who are fighting racism on our streets today. But never mind the COVID lockdown, that doesn't apply today or something.
Yes.
And the mayor also approved as well.
I was going to say, I understand that the mayor of Bristol, who's black, and I think was celebrating this as I think he said something about the damage done to our people, as though he only represented black people in Bristol, which I think is a bit of a dodgy thing for a mayor to do.
Well, maybe that's the way he feels. Maybe that's the way he sees himself.
Yeah, I think he was in the police control room when the operation took place. As I understand it, the rank and file. I got this off an ex-copper off Twitter who's been talking to his friends in Bristol, and the story I heard was that the rank and file coppers knew this was happening, said to their superiors, "Look, we should do something about this. They're getting grappling irons and ropes and things. They're ready to take down this statue. It's going to be a civil disorder. We should deal with it." And the superiors said, "No, we're going to take a back seat on this one. We don't want to get in the way." Almost as though they actually wanted it to happen, and you see that in some of the interviews.
The superiors do, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they're in lockstep with the council, with the mayor. I haven't heard what the MPs have to say. I'm sure they supported it as well, and they're all left-wing MPs. So yes. It's a political violence for me, but not for thee. It's when it serves the cause, when it's part of the comradely struggle against the dead slave owners. Yeah, congratulations. You get your chance to take an Instagram selfie with a statue you've destroyed. Yeah, well done. Congratulations. And so the problem is this gives it tacit approval. So no one's going to I shouldn't imagine anyone's going to get prosecuted for this. No one's going to pay costs for this. It's not going to get restored. What we're going to get is, I don't know, but I'm 90% sure it's going to be a statue of a slave, or it's going to be a slave, or it's going to be a monument to slavery. And you imagine what would happen if a mob of white supremacists came to defile that? Do you think the police would back off then?
I'm going to hazard a guess, and I'm going to say no. But I reckon they'd send in the riot police.
The good thing is, James, that will not happen, because in Britain we don't have enough white supremacists to form a rugby team, let alone a mob. So it's an academic.
That's a very good point. Obviously, I'm concerned about the city's historic architectural heritage artistic heritage being destroyed. That's bad. But equally worrying, I think, is the point you made, that if the police are now signalling that they define what is and isn't crime, what is and isn't vandalism,
in a politically directed manner.
Exactly, based on how politically acceptable it is. So suddenly the police have decided that it is, if a cause is politically acceptable to them, then vandalism is justified, mob violence is justified. Now that's really scary, isn't it?
Yeah, because what happens next? What's the next statue? What's the next target? We've got to pull down some plaques, got to pull down some gravestones, got to smash some windows because they were donated by, this trader or that trader. We have to smash a few cathedral windows. Yeah. So and then you start burn. Then you burn some books, and if anyone says, "Hey, Perhaps that's a bad thing. Maybe we should keep those things even though you don't agree with them. We can't remove things by force, by violence, by disorder. Then those people become targets.
That's it. The iconoclasm is a gateway drug towards violence on living, breathing people.
Yes.
Is it not?
Yeah. What happens? So if we're measuring justification for violence by strength of feeling, so what happens when people feel very, very strongly about what the mayor's done? Maybe they feel very strongly, maybe they want to burn down his office, maybe they want to burn down his house. Who's to say? Because they feel very passionately about their cause. Why shouldn't they be allowed to burn down some houses?
Yeah.
You see, you can't start picking and choosing what illegal activity you're going to prosecute and what you're going to sort of actually tacitly encourage. And the problem is that now the precedent has been set. People all over Britain have seen what happened in London on the same day, and they saw what happened in Bristol, and they saw nothing happened. They saw there were no prosecutions, there was no riot police, no one was going in with batons. And so this gives tacit, this is a gateway to the next act, because why should they stop? They had a buzz, they had a riot, they had a good time, they got some selfies, they were fighting the patriarchy, except of course the establishment completely approved of it. The Bristol establishment completely approved of this act of cultural vandalism.
I tell you one of the things that's been worrying me. I've been following the reporting on Twitter, and I noticed that quite a few of my conservative friends, I mean, I don't know what the word is for kind of being of the same view as me, you know, whether you're classical liberal or libertarian or people generally on the right. I was disappointed to see some of them saying stuff like, well, I disapprove of slavery. I think that they, you know, why should the or even sort of the younger groovier ones doing lols about how hey, if you looked at the geo map of where the statue is now, it's been located underneath the water in the docks, and that this is really funny.
Do you know who retweeted that photograph, that sort of Google Maps image? The ICA's director. The director of the ICA said, good for them for destroying property, good for them for destroying sculpture. Let's talk about reparations. So this is the director of the ICA in London.
The Institute of Contemporary Arts, I imagine it's a long time since the ICA has cared much about art.
He's an itinerant art curator who called Stefan Kalmar. He lives in Berlin. Doesn't even live in London. It's not his cultural heritage.
He's a sort of pop-up art director.
Yeah, he doesn't. It doesn't matter, because when the ICA is closed due to various reasons, which I think maybe is the subject for another podcast. When the ICA gets closed down, he'll just move to a part-time job in Barcelona or New York or Montreal. Yeah, it doesn't really matter to him. So at the moment, he's advocating, the German person is advocating that we destroy our own culture. Thank you very much. But anyway, what I would say is to your friends who are so opposed to slavery, and to those young, brave activists who defied the corona lockdown on Sunday, I would say to them, why don't you go to one of the many, many mosques in Bristol and look the imam in the eye and have a discussion with him about whether or not he supports the Quranic principle of enslavement, which is currently being practiced in Chad, Mali, Sudan, Niger. So today the Quran is being used to justify enslavement of real living people today. How concerned are they about that? How much did they know about it? They didn't even know it existed. But I guess anti-slavery activity can take all forms.
I don't think that a lot of, even on the right, I'm afraid, that many people have the intellectual tools, the kind of structured belief system to understand why it is that even if the statue of a slaver is of a slaver, you shouldn't pull it down. They don't seem to make the connection that with history, with the need to preserve some link with the past in order to give ourselves a sort of cultural cohesion and a sense of national identity. They don't get that, because you wouldn't, for example, get. I was disappointed with Andrew Neil, for example. Andrew Neil, he's not stupid. He's a conservative, and there aren't many out conservative voices in our culture at the moment for obvious reasons.
He's pretty much a unicorn, isn't he?
Andrew, yeah. Well, certainly at the BBC, Andrew tweeted out that he was glad that in Belgium, well, I don't know if it was in Belgium, I presume it was in Belgium, they had pulled down a statue to Leopold II because he was responsible for genocide. Well, I know that genocide is bad, okay. I'm not sure we really needed Andrew Neil to tell us that. I'm not sure what the point of his tweet was, other than to sort of virtue signal and enable him, I suppose, to be conservative on other issues. But explain what's wrong with even.
I think that Andrew Neil was completely correct, because when I walked through Broadquay past the Colston statue, as I did every day before I was furloughed, when we still had jobs and could go to an office.
Yeah.
I walked past that
long time ago.
I walked past that statue every day, and every time I walked past that statue, I felt a strange urge to enslave people. But now it's gone. I think I'll probably be okay. I probably don't think I'm going to be enslaving anyone. So I think it worked. I think the problem.
Well, that's good.
I think the problem with conservatives is that they're so complacent, because they think that even like the white middle class liberals who are sort of feel guilt about something they didn't do and something not even their grandparents did, is that they think they think that this is limited. They think they can stop it. They think the mob is only going to go after things that they disapprove of or dislike. But the mob is not going to stop. The dynamic of the mob and the psychology of the mob and the lack of restraint for a mob. I'm talking here about a mob, about a group of people who engage in violent action. I'm not talking about protesters or crowds. Those are different things, but I'm talking here about the mob. The psychology of the mob will lead them to go further. They must go further. And also they are led by people who are committed political activists, who are extremists, who are radicals, and they will never be satisfied. They want to destroy more and more, because they are filled with hatred for our society and for our history. And they are not going to stop with a couple of statues. They're going to go for church windows. They're going to go for cathedrals. They're going to go for paintings in pictures. They're going to be smashing up portrait busts. They're going to be burning books. And the thing is that with conservatives and these middle-class liberals who think, oh, well, I don't like slavery, and oh, maybe that will be okay. It's not going to stop them. It encourages them. It will go on and on. And it's going to lead to deaths. And maybe those deaths will be accidental. Maybe, someone's going to get burned up in a fire. Well, it happens when you're rioting. But I think the conservatives are far too complacent about it.
Yes. I almost feel that that's a kind of natural conclusion to this conversation, because I fear this too. I mean, I've been getting a lot of messages today, particularly on my Patreon, actually, from people who've kind of seen me as a kind of a sort of Helm's Deep, one of the few voices left that's really standing up for our Western civilization. I mean, it really is. I think I was quite pissed off by that Andrew Neil tweet, and Alison Pearson, who I'm normally a fan of, she tweeted something similar about how she was happy for the Colston statue to be pulled down. What is it about culture that you do not? What is it about the culture wars that you do not get? That we really are in dangerous times, and it's not just in the UK either. I mean, America's got actually a quick word about pulling down statues of Robert E. Lee, for example, Confederate statue. What?
Still, they're still doing it. They were doing it. What was it? Was it? Oh yeah, it was in the Trump thing. It was 2016. I wrote an article about them, and I said this is going to continue. This is going to get worse. I said we should keep these statues, we should contextualize them. If they're in immediate danger, then maybe they should be taken inside buildings. But you know, I mean, they're going to break into buildings eventually. They're going to burn down art galleries and so forth.
How do you stop this happening?
You protect these things. You protect objects with police. When violence starts, you disperse the crowd. When people commit violence or damage things, then you prosecute them. You fine them. You have people who are responsible in government, so you have local politicians, national politicians, condemning violence, saying, look, if you don't like this, win some elections, get some people into local council, and we'll talk about maybe contextualizing things, possibly moving some things into museums. But that's as much as you get. We need to stand firm, and people should not be ashamed or afraid to say people should follow the law. There's lots of stuff that I see in art galleries that I don't like. I would rather it's not there. I would rather the money hadn't been spent on it. I find it irritating or frustrating and sometimes upsetting, but I've never assaulted it. I've never attacked it. And we have to say, look, you, as well as we, have to abide by this principle of non-intervention, non-violent intervention, because the hammers that get used on statues eventually get used on people's skulls.
Nice one. I think that's a good ending. Thank you, Alexander Adams. And I really do recommend your book, Culture War, Art, Identity, Politics and Cultural Entryism. Actually, I particularly recommend it to undergraduates, people who need to understand clearly why things like the canon matter. Because, I mean, you know, it affects me too as a student of English literature. It's that we've got the same problems. People studying history got the same problems. They want to decolonize the curriculum because, of course, supposedly it favors dead white European males. But that you explain why the canon is the way it is and why it works and why we need it and why you can't just come along and take the year zero approach. So thank you, Alexander, very much. And
My pleasure,
it's been
James.
nice talking to you.
It's been great. Thank you very much, James.
Thanks.